I'd like to thank the organising committee for accepting this paper, and I apologise for the lack of clips, which proved beyond my technical skills. Most people attending this conference no doubt already know the Battle of Thermopylae was, on the Greek side, an inter-polis affair. As well as Spartan and Laconian forces facing Xerxes' Persian army, there were Tegeans, Mantineans, Arcadians and others from elsewhere in the Peloponnese, and Thebans, Thespians and others from central and northern Greece. Who exactly sent contingents and how large they were is difficult to determine. I show here various figures found in the differing sources. For this paper, it doesn't really matter. What is important is that it wasn't just the Spartans. Furthermore, the defence of Thermopylae was part of a coordinated plan to slow down the Persian invasion, the other half of which was the naval battle of Artemisium. The two most significant players in this Hellenic alliance, of course, were Sparta and the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League, and Athens. Nevertheless, the legend that is built up around Thermopylae focuses almost exclusively upon the 300 full Spartan citizens who gave their lives there, and everyone else gets sidelined to one degree or another. This really begins with the account of Herodotus, and in particular his quotation of the epigraph to the Spartans. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. You see here its modern reproduction. Such a view can be seen in later receptions of the battle, such as Jacques-Louis David's 1814 painting, Leonidas at Thermopylae. In that, the centre of attention is the Spartan king Leonidas, and the other prominent figures wear the red cloaks of Sparta. If there are troops from other contingents, and there may be, as soldiers in other colours are seen, they are in the background and are not identified. In this paper, I'm going to examine how the internationalism of the historical Greek resistance to Persia is reflected in 3 movies made either about or featuring the Battle of Thermopylae. I'm leaving out of consideration here Meet the Spartans. That unsubtle and unfunny parody of 300 does, of course, include Thermopylae, but in a way that is so far removed from any historical reality that it is not helpful to include it here. I should add that I am interested here only in the internationalism on the Greek side. The cosmopolitan nature of the invading Persian army is a matter for another day. I am therefore going to be looking at 3 movies: 1962's The 300 Spartans, 2006's remake of that, 300, and 2014's sequel to 300, 300 Rise of an Empire. I begin with The 300 Spartans. This movie commences with the army of Xerxes crossing over into Europe. The action then shifts to an anachronistic council of all the Greeks located in Corinth, one perhaps influenced by the cinematic depiction of the historical League of Corinth seen 6 years earlier in Alexander the Great. 4 people speak at this Greek assembly. First is an unnamed delegate played by Lawrence Naismith, who advocates that the cities of Greece preserve their independence by all dealing with the Persians independently. It isn't clear which polis he originates from, but it has already been established in the movie that the one thing that King Xerxes does not want is for the Greeks to unite. So Naismith's character is already seen as a bad person. He is followed by the Athenian representative Themistocles, played by Ralph Richardson, then a representative from Phocis, and finally the King of Sparta, Leonidas, played by Richard Egan. I pronounce his name as Leonidas because that's how all the movies pronounce it. Unity of the Greeks is achieved by the promise of Sparta to go to war against Persia, whether others will follow or not. Themistocles then places Athens' fleet under Spartan command. As he later reveals, the Spartan admiral, being inexperienced, will not interfere with Themistocles' commands to the fleet. Subsequently, it is revealed that Themistocles and Leonidas had been working closely together. However, the efforts of Sparta are not as committed to the idea of Greek unity as Leonidas is, and they refuse to authorize the dispatch of the Spartan army. Leonidas therefore marches to Thermopylae with just the 300 men of his personal bodyguard, and, it would appear, significant numbers of unarmoured helpers, presumably helots, though they are never named as such. At Thermopylae, Leonidas is joined by 700 Thespians, and by implication in one line, people from other cities. We later learn that the Phocians are sent to guard the goat path around the back of the pass of Thermopylae, as indeed they were in history. Nevertheless, it is the Spartans who play the primary role in fighting the Persians. The other Greeks are kept in reserve. We do not see the Phocians either when they are sent to the goat path or when they are driven away from it. The Thespians do join the Spartans in their final suicidal stand, but their deaths all take place off-screen. Through this, Leonidas has regular meetings with Themistocles, coordinating the defiance of the Persian army with the support given by Athenian ships. It's dangerous to see movies as simplistic allegories of contemporary politics. However, they are products of their times, and there are resonances. In the case of 300 Spartans, it is interesting that the chief representative of Sparta is a young American actor, Richard Egan, 40 at the time of filming, whilst the chief Athenian is played by a dependable Englishman, 61-year-old Sir Ralph Richardson. Many of the other Spartans were played by American actors, though not all. Briton Robert Brown and Greek Mikhailis Nikoliniakos played Spartans. This created an association of Sparta with America and of Athens with Britain. These nations, America and Britain, had, of course, been in alliance with each other against Germany in the Second World War, within living memory for the majority of cinema goers in 1962. They were also allies against the Soviet Union in 1962. The Cold War was at its height then and would soon erupt into the Cuban Missile Crisis, a few months after the 300 Spartans was released. Through the age difference between Egan and Richardson, Athens appears as the older civilization, with the Spartans as brash newcomers. This was the reverse of the historical reality, where Athens was the state that had newly emerged to take on a more important role in Greek affairs, challenging the long-established dominance of Sparta. But it was how some people saw the relationship between the fading imperial power of Britain and the new rising power of America. Future Prime Minister Harold Macmillan had in the early 1940s characterized Anglo-American relations as like those of the intellectually superior Greeks and the more powerful Romans, and that continued to be a way in which the special relationship was envisaged. That relationship had been strained not many years before. In 1956, under the premiership of Anthony Eden, seen here on the left, Britain had attempted to flex its old imperial muscles in Egypt, seizing control of the Suez Canal. The United States, under President Eisenhower on the right, condemned Britain's actions and forced Eden to back down. There might be a hint of that in the notion that some Spartans do not want to stand alongside Athens, because the two had not that long ago been at war. One might also see in the Greek assembly at Corinth echoes of the United Nations. To many Americans, after the early success in taking the initiative in taking action in the Korean War, the UN had often become paralysed due to the Soviet Union and the US acting at loggerheads with each other. In the 300 Spartans, we see what can happen with an international assembly where the two most powerful members have a united purpose. As a child, comics writer and artist Frank Miller saw the 300 Spartans and found it inspirational. Clearly, the internationalism of the movie was not part of what inspired Miller, as it is almost entirely absent from his graphic novel 300. Hence, it is also absent from the movie based upon that graphic novel. Athens is completely sidelined from this movie. All that remains is a dismissive reference to them as philosophers and boy lovers. Nor do Sparta's other allies fare much better. In places of the thespians of 300 Spartans, we get Daxos and his Arcadians. They are treated with rather more contempt by Leonidas than the thespians are in 300 Spartans. On the other hand, they do at least get something to do, having an opportunity to attack the Persian immortals. But, for the most part, as in 300 Spartans, the Spartans carry out the bulk of the fighting. The only other Greeks to get mentioned here are, as in 300 Spartans, the Phocians who are meant to guard the goat path. Once again, however, they are only ever mentioned and not seen, either when assigned to the task or when defeated. We do see the Persian fleet, but we don't have any idea that there is a Greek fleet sent to oppose them. Instead, the Persian ships are destroyed by the natural elements which have teamed up on the Spartan side. There's a sense then, backed up by dehumanizing the Persians in a way that 300 Spartans simply doesn't do, there's a sense that only the Spartans matter. What does this mean in the context of when 300 was made? Again, I am reluctant to overinterpret this. I'm not sure I buy the argument that 300 is a deliberate cheerleader for neoconservatism and crypto-fascism, not least because if that was the sort of movie I wanted to make, this isn't the movie I would produce. The movie is a product of George W. Bush's America. That was an America that declared its right to do what it wanted in foreign policy, regardless of anyone else. Does that carry over into the portrayal of Sparta in 300? And finally, there is 300 Rise of an Empire, a somewhat meaningless title adopted because the early ideas, Xerxes and 300 The Battle of Artemisia, were deemed too exotic. Creatively, this is undoubtedly the worst of the three movies, and none of these are movies that I would label as good. But politically, it is in some ways the most intriguing. It shifts the focus away from the buff Spartans to the almost as buff Athenians. These are under the leadership of the surprisingly buff and surprisingly Australian Themistocles. The movie negotiates a far more complex relationship between Athens and Sparta than 300 itself can admit. The audience are deprived of the sort of interaction between Themistocles and Leonidas that is found in 300 Spartans due to Gerard Butler's unwillingness to return to the role. Instead, Themistocles engages with Queen Gorgo. To generate a degree of tension, this does require retconning Gorgo to make her reluctant to do something, that is, send the Spartans out of Sparta, that she is all for in 300. Indeed, the Spartans as a whole have to be retconned so as to remove almost all sense of idealism from their motivations. They only care about themselves. The movie's idealism is all vested in Themistocles, who seeks to build a united and a free Greece, seeing one as a prerequisite for the other. There is also an implication that he is fighting for democracy, about which Gorgo, in her narration, is surprisingly kind. Early in the movie, we see a version of the council scene that we saw in 300 Spartans. However, this one is rather more lively. It begins in fisticuffs, and I apologise for the quality of this image. There's also a sly, half-heard reference to the Spartans as muscle-bound boy lovers, a response to Leonidas' jibe from 300. It's not clear whether or not this is an Athenian democratic assembly or a wider interpolis body. Themistocles certainly addresses it as if it's the former, but later points to the ambassadors from Argos, Corinth and Megara who are present. After this assembly, however, all the sea battles seem to be exclusively Athenian affairs, just as the Battle of Thermopylae is almost exclusively a Spartan affair. Only at the end of the Battle of Salamis does a massive Spartan-led fleet, including Arcadians, Olympians, Thebans, and people from Delphi, arrive to save the day. In a way, this makes perfect sense in the context of the 300 franchise, which is very much a pro-Spartan version of ancient history. But it runs entirely against the idea of Salamis as the great Athenian victory, which has been promoted ever since Aeschylus wrote the Persians in 472 BCE. I find it difficult to interpret this movie in the context of when it was made. Why does producer and writer Zack Snyder choose to undermine the message of 300 only to sort of restore it at the end? The movie was released in 2014, and that is midway through the second term of Barack Obama's presidency. In November of that year, the Republicans would take control of the Senate and thus overall control of Congress, and would intensify their policy of obstructing the president. Is 300 Rise of an Empire a plea for American unity? Given that Snyder is also director and co-writer of the extended lingerie commercial that is Sucker Punch, it may be that such an interpretation is overthinking 300 Rise of an Empire. To conclude, we see in these three movies differing attitudes towards the interpolis nature of the resistance against the Persian invasion of Greece. However, to interpret those differences as necessarily reflecting contemporary attitudes may be to assume levels of subtlety that do not exist. What is notable is that all three, in one way or another, centre the Spartans as the true heroes of the Persian Wars.